Welcome, everyone, to the PFF Fantasy Podcast. I'm John Macri, and joining me once again, PFF's lead fantasy analyst, Nathan Jahnke. Nate, we made it. We got preseason football this week. Tomorrow night, the Hall of Fame game where, we won't see any of the Bears starters. Probably not any of the Texans starters either. But, hey, it's NFL football in its own kind of way. So how are you feeling, getting into things here? The preseason is ramping up. You think we'll get any useful takeaways from tomorrow's game?
I hope so. I think at the very least, hearing who is playing versus who isn't playing in the game, that's always telling as well of who the team deems valuable enough to not risk them in the preseason versus those that they are willing to risk. So especially like some of the backup running backs, those kind of things. I think the Texans wide receivers as well, who they're sitting versus who they're not sitting, the Bears running backs, that kind of stuff. So I think we'll get at least a little bit of interesting stuff. Probably won't be as interesting as when Josh Jacobs played deep into like the second quarter of the Hall of Fame game and everyone completely overreacted to that. But we at least get football back, and that's the best part.
That is the best part. Yeah, we'll we're eased back into it with the Hall of Fame game, but it'll be a fun watch anyways. But that's tomorrow. But today we're talking breakout running backs. A couple of weeks ago we did breakout quarterbacks, so now it's time for the running backs. Our criteria was essentially players that haven't finished as a high-end RB1 or high-end, or not high-end, just haven't finished as an RB1 or high-end RB2 before, either in points per game or overall finish. And we're really kind of looking for a decent increase in production from previous seasons, not just like a slight improvement, basically. So hopefully that makes sense as we kind of go through our list here. But as we go through, we'll talk about why we feel like these running backs are in for a breakout season. So let's get right into it here and kick things off with one of your picks, Nate, at the top from the Pittsburgh Steelers. Tell us about what you like about Jaylen Warren's potential breakout season in 2024.
Yeah, Jaylen Warren, his numbers have been great throughout his time in the NFL. He's been a receiving back, but as a rusher, 5.8 yards per carry against 7 or fewer man boxes, 4 yards per carry on non-perfectly blocked plays. So plays where an offensive lineman screws up, typically running backs only average around 3 or so yards per carry on those plays, so he's been great at those. 6.8 on gap run plays and 5.3 when he follows the intended point of attack. All of those in the 90th percentile or better for running backs, so he's been great as a runner. Averages 0.36 avoided tackles per carry. That's been by far the best for running backs over the past 2 years. 0.29 is the next closest. And then as a receiver, he's had a great target rate, 24.3% targets per route, fifth best among running backs. Unfortunately, he's had a negative 1.5 average depth of target, which is not great. That makes it harder for him to get yards on those plays. But like the big difference for the Steelers this season is Arthur Smith is the new offensive coordinator. He has run the ball a lot more than expected in his past coaching instances, so we should expect lots of running, and then as well as that, a lot of targets to the running backs. So that's all great news for the Steelers running backs in general. In an ideal world, we see Warren kind of take the role that Bijan Robinson had. We see Harris take the role that Tyler Algier had, in which case Warren has like top 10 fantasy potential. I think the big red flag for me is the one area that Najee Harris has been outperforming Jaylen Warren as a runner is on zone run plays. And Arthur Smith has been the most zone-heavy offensive coordinator or offensive play caller in the last few seasons. That dates back as well to his time with the Falcons as well as with the Tennessee Titans. If you look at like who he coached under and who they coached under, this all goes back to those Denver Broncos, Alex Gibbs days where they were so zone heavy and it worked really well for them. So I think that's just part of his coaching DNA. So that's probably my biggest concern for Warren is they like to run zone so much. And that's been the one thing that Warren hasn't been as good at. So that's the only reason I don't have Warren even higher on my rankings than I currently do. But I still think Warren, with his talent, should be in store for a big season. And with a new coaching staff, like anytime you have an incumbent coach, they kind of view the players the same way they did before. So before they were viewing Harris as the starter, where I think a new coach might look at this backfield differently than the previous coaches have.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm hoping as well. Like, I definitely like Warren. I think, it just kind of comes down to what to trust from this backfield in Pittsburgh, right? Arthur Smith coming in as the offensive coordinator could switch things up a little bit. And I'm with you. Like, I think Warren, to me, like if you're looking at him versus Najee Harris, for example, like he definitely stands out as the better value than Harris at the very least. And I thought Harris did play well last year, especially relative like to years past for him, but it still wasn't to the level of what Jaylen Warren was doing, who just kind of continues to prove that he's the better kind of all around back of the two. I know Harris dominated the goal line touches last year. I think it was 23 carries to Warren's 7, and then even routes run in goal to go situations 11 for Harris to Warren's 4, which, considering that Warren got more receiving work overall, it does at least seem that coaching staff preferred Harris in those high scoring areas of the field, which again could definitely change this year with the new offensive coordinator. We just don't know for sure yet. But yeah, I'm with you. I think what won't change is Harris seeing the majority of pass down work. It's just very clear that he's much better than Harris in that role. Even if you're just looking at last season, like Harris's most efficient season of his career, he still doesn't really compare to Jaylen Warren, right? Across pretty much all receiving metrics that we seem to care about, receiving grade, target rate, yards per route run, yards after catch per reception, yards per reception, completion rate when targeted, all those things kind of favor Warren. So I really don't think we need to be, concerned about Harris on passing downs as much. And then, like you said, like, yeah, Harris was better on those zone runs, but as a runner overall, Warren was still better than what we got from Najee Harris in general, right? 84.4 rushing grade for Warren versus 77.2 for Harris, 5.2 yards per carry versus 4, 24.2% first down touchdown rate for Warren versus 19% for Harris, 16.5% explosive run rate for Warren versus 9.3 for Harris. Like, and again, better stuff run rate, better yards after contact per attempt, better missed tackles force per attempt, literally everything Warren does better. So the hope, is that even if he doesn't, I guess, take like that goal line work from Harris, that he can at least kind of eat into everything else, because there's definitely room for improvement. And like you said, being a more run heavy offense this year, if it's not at an exact 50-50 split or favoring Warren, like there could still be more touches to go around overall, because that was an area like outside of the red zone where Harris did kind of dominate the carry 62% to 38%. I say dominated, it's relatively close. Even those targets like 67% to 33% in favor of Warren outside the red zone. We want him to eat, I think, into those middle of the field carries a little bit more, which I think is possible. So we'll see. It should be a fun one to kind of monitor in season, and hopefully not frustrating at all. Right, Arthur Smith. But yeah, it's I'm with you. I like Warren quite a bit, and if he can start to get more touches, then that is absolutely going to be in his favor over Najee Harris, who is getting drafted ahead of him right now. So we do like that value.
Yeah, and like if you look at ADP per running backs, you have like all of the feature running backs first, then you have all of the clear two down backs after that, and then you start getting into a lot of the running backs that are 2-man committees, which is basically mostly what we'll be talking about today, as guys that are picked in those range anyway. But I think Warren, currently consensus ADP running back 27. I currently have him as RB25. I'll probably be moving him up at least one spot. I just wrote DeAndre Swift's player profile earlier today, and I'm like, there's so much that could go wrong in that backfield. So probably at least moving Warren up one more spot. But I think you can really start to look at some of those 2-down backs and consider someone like Warren ahead of some of those guys, just because that upside is there, where there's a number of situations where there's not a ton of upside for that player. So yeah, they'll probably be a fantasy starter, but they're not going to be a fantasy starter that you're excited to put in your lineup. Or Warren has at least that potential to be a lot higher than what he was, considering like his utilization got so much better from one year to the next in every category. We could see that kind of shift again this year.
Yeah, I'm with you. All right, the next guy that we have on the list here, I think we both liked him a fair bit heading into this season as well. From the Tennessee Titans, it's Tajay Spears, and I guess kind of similar with Warren and Najee. Spears, doesn't have like that clear path to touches, like you said, after the team signed Tony Pollard to a pretty nice 3-year contract this offseason. But even if Pollard plays the lead role there as the top running back, like there's at least a path for Spears to break out. And I kind of compared it not too dissimilarly to like James White back in 2018. So just a kind of reminder of what that looked like. James White, much like Spears, he was averaging between 4 and 5 targets per game and only 3 carries per game prior to his breakout season. But then White increased his carries per game closer to 6, which is where Spears was already at as a rookie in 2023. But his targets per game increased significantly, which could be one of the ways that Spears delivers breakout fantasy production in 2024. Like he could very well just maintain his 6.1 carries per game from last season, but ultimately it may come down to more targets and receptions as the offense finds more success in the passing game, specifically an improvement from quarterback Will Levis, which we highlighted in the Breakout Quarterbacks episodes a couple weeks ago. And part of my belief in Will Levis breaking out and improving in year 2, which we talked about a couple weeks ago again, was coming from being coached towards more like high percentage throws and honestly, what's more high percentage than those low ADOT targets to a running back, right? So Levis actually already showed a top 3 tendency to target the running back position last season at 20.4% of his targets. So kind of leaning into that as well in order to kind of cut down on the many deep throws could also kind of be crucial for Spears' jump in fantasy production. But that's one way. I like it for a breakout. I like the path for a breakout for Spears. But what I really like about Spears is that there's kind of multiple ways that he could potentially break out. So I'll let you talk about Spears before I, ramble on too long about him here.
Oh, yeah. Like, first off, we definitely like him as a player. He was the 12th highest graded running back overall last season, 5th highest avoided tackle rate on run plays, pretty good yards after contact at 3.1, which was 11th best, and the second most avoided tackles as a receiver. And when you consider how many receiving running backs had more volume than Spears, it was pretty impressive that he had that many avoided tackles. So we really like him as a player. And I think, like you're saying, with the situation in Tennessee, I know there was a quote going around recently of like they have 2 starting running backs from the coaching staff. So we can take solid guesses of how we think these running backs will be used. I think Pollard's likely to be used on early downs, Spears likely on later downs, similar to how Spears was used last year, but we don't know that for sure. There's a chance that Spears plays a lot more on early downs than what we expect. We saw Pollard, our highest graded running back, the 2 previous seasons combined, and then was off to a poor start and then started playing a lot better the second half of last season. So I at least still consider Pollard one of the best runners in the league, but we don't know how the snaps will be distributed in Tennessee at this point. So I think for me, I have Spears a lot higher than a bunch of guys who are more so just handcuffs. Like he's only going about a round ahead of Trey Benson, for example. And I think Benson's only real path to playing time is a James Conner injury, where obviously here if Tony Pollard suffers an injury, then Spears has a ton of potential in this backfield, but there's a chance he gets there even without an injury. We don't know how it'll shake out. And a big part as well is like we saw in Cincinnati, which is where the head coach came from, like Joe Mixon was just a consistent top 12 fantasy running back. So the offensive philosophy is one that can get a running back to the top 12 level. So whether or not he can get there with Pollard in the backfield as well is another question. But just in terms of guys that are getting picked in this range, the amount of talent that he has mixed with the unknown is what's exciting about him here.
Yeah, for sure. Like I said, I like the path for him, as a passing down back, but like you said, there's definitely a path for him to get more carries as well and work in as an early down back as well. And like, I mean, as much as I believe Pollard is better than kind of what he showed last year as a whole, like he's not necessarily the competition for touches that Derrick Henry was for a guy like an unproven rookie like Spears was last year, especially now after what he's shown in year 1 and heading into year 2. So it's not impossible for him to get close to like double-digit carries per game. And Brian Callahan, like you said, he's already kind of come out and said that he kind of sees Spears and Pollard as interchangeable. So it's not like he'll necessarily be relegated to that passing down role either. So more difficult path to, to touches, maybe when considering Pollard's contract and history of being like a good running back. But again, it's not impossible, especially considering that Spears himself was pretty damn good last year as a rookie. Top 5 mark in missed tackles forced per attempt, 11th in yards after contact per attempt, like you said. So I think there's a lot to like about Tajay Spears, and I if Pollard doesn't get off to that hot start or isn't showing what he was in previous years in Dallas and camp, like there's definitely going to be more of a tendency to want to utilize the younger Tajay Spears in that offense. So I'm pretty excited about him. I definitely think he can have a breakout season this year.
Yeah, and we'll just add like their ages as well. We expect Spears, a player at his age, to get better in his second season, where Pollard's 27, which seems pretty young, but for running back years, that is starting to get to the point where we start to see running backs decline in efficiency at least a little bit, or at least not getting better. So there's also a chance we just see Spears get better, Pollard get worse, and therefore Spears would be the lead guy that way.
Yep. Makes perfect sense. All right, let's talk about a player on a new team set to potentially take on a pretty big workload. Nate, what do you like about Devin Singletary for 2024?
Sure. So in general, breakouts, we're talking about guys that we think have a chance to have a really great season. With Singletary, this is more just, I think he's a great value where he currently is at his ADP. Clear path to being the feature back for the Giants. Has always throughout his career performed well on non-perfectly blocked plays. He hasn't had great offensive lines in the past. In Buffalo, it was they prioritized pass blocking a lot more than run blocking in the offensive lines, which helped their pass game, not so much their run game. And then last year in Houston, they had like 10 different offensive linemen play at least 200 snaps with all the injuries they were dealing with throughout the season and all the changing of various offensive line combinations. So it wasn't a great situation there. So he's kind of used to these not great offensive lines, which is what he's going to end up seeing with the Giants. Reuniting with Brian Daboll, who was with Buffalo for a number of years before becoming the Giants head coach. So there's that connection as well. They don't have all that much competition for touches there. Like they drafted Tyrone Tracy in the 5th round. Eric Ray is there. I wouldn't be surprised whatsoever if one of them earned the 3rd down role, but in general, if someone is playing everything but 3rd downs, that's generally a good thing for their fantasy value because running backs have to come off the field at some point for the most part. And if they're coming off on 3rd downs, which is when they're least likely to score fantasy points, then generally they're still playing well for fantasy perspective. So I'm not worried about someone winning the 3rd down job with New York outside of Singletary. So like, volume is king in fantasy football, and he's currently getting drafted at ADP 35 because people keep trying to get running backs with upside, but he has a pretty clear path to being a top 24 running back. I have him at RB 29 right now with that thought of he's probably going to finish ahead of RB 29. He's just probably very unlikely to finish in the top 15 running backs. But there's a chance things go better than expected with New York. Maybe they start scoring more points. Singletary starts scoring some touchdowns, in which case he could have a better season than that. But so other guys, I'm like excited that they could have elite seasons. With Singletary, it's more so just he's going to outperform his ADP as long as he stays healthy. So it's good to have guys like that, especially if you're excited about a bunch of these other running backs, so that if these other running backs aren't doing as well during various points of the season, then you can start Singletary. And once one of those sleeper running backs starts performing better, then you can start them ahead of Singletary.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Like he's somebody that, like you said, I mean, you look at his ADP right now, like probably one of the more underrated, I think, running backs, and just overall too in the NFL. I think he's a very good running back, like definitely capable of that 2-down role. And for ADP purposes, I think he could definitely outperform where he's being drafted. I know, for breakout, like you said, probably more of a value than like a true breakout. I think he did finish as like RB 20 or something like that in 2021. So it's been a while since he's been there, but he can definitely get back to that range just based on the volume that he's going to get on those early downs. I think, part of too, like what probably pushes him down, and I guess the concern comes from with Singletary is just like the potential for like a lack of like high quality touches, like passing down work, but also like the Giants offense not maybe being good enough to get him into scoring opportunities at a high enough rate, right? So that probably plays into it. Daniel Jones is going to play, but doesn't inspire like a lot of confidence, even with Malik Neighbors. I don't know how good they'll be, to get into scoring position. I think they were 29th in red zone plays last year, 30th in goal line plays. Obviously, Daniel Jones didn't play the whole year, but passing down work, like you said, I like Tyrone Tracy for that role. It seems like he's getting a lot of that work in camp. I'd written about Tracy as a rookie sleeper post draft just because of his history as a wide receiver previously. And, Singletary, he's actually had like decent targets in each of his NFL seasons. He's had at least 45 targets every year, just hasn't been like particularly great at it. I don't think he's ever cracked a 65 receiving grade. So I think it makes sense that, he's just the early down back there, but there's value in that they're going to have opportunities to run the ball, probably not so much with a lead or anything like that, where you're getting those bonus carries, but I like him for where he's being drafted. And I just hope that, the offense is better than we expect to maybe give him a little bit more of a boost there to potentially come closer to that top 24 running back than, on the fringes kind of thing, I guess.
Yeah. And there's not much room for the offense to do worse than what we expect. So it's either they're going to do exactly what we expect them to do, or they're going to do better. So it's either he's going to be right in that range. And like, if you look at all the games and filter out the ones where he was like clearly a backup, he's been a fantasy starter, top 24 running back on over half of his starts the last 3 years and each of the last 3 years. So he's been in that range before in a bad offense where he's not the priority, but he is the main running back.
Yeah, absolutely. So they can't disappoint us too much more, obviously, in New York. But let's talk about another running back breakout candidate on a bad offense, a potentially bad offense. We'll make the case here for Zamir White of the Las Vegas Raiders. So obviously, we're going to have very similar concerns with White here as we maybe did with Singletary, just as far as the offense goes and potential for scoring. But for him, finishing as like RB 20 or higher, that would clearly be his best season by far. So top 24 I think is in his potential range of outcomes here, and it starts first and foremost, like any running back, with volume being the key, right? Like we saw it last year where the Raiders went from relying on Josh Jacobs for 21.9 opportunities per game in 2023 right into relying on White for 23.8 opportunities per game to close out the last 4 games of the season. So that's carries and targets combined. And the Raiders, the good thing is they've already kind of shown a confidence in White to handle a significant workload. And that confidence kind of appears to be solidified by not really drafting or signing any significant competition for touches this offseason. Like they added Alexander Madison, who was one of the league's most inefficient backs from 2023. Dylan Labe, I like him as like a potential sleeper, but he's a 6th round rookie pick as well. Far from the favorite for playing time, I would assume. And if anything, maybe serves as like a 3rd down back more than anything else, Labe, to start. So I think, 23.8 opportunities per game, that's a high number for someone like White to maintain across an entire season. That would be obviously like the best mark in the league, better than Christian McCaffrey, Kyron Williams, Saquon Barkley, all of those guys. So that being said, like I think there's a good chance the Raiders are set to rely on him pretty heavily, coming in just under 20 opportunities per game. I don't think would be that much of a surprise, in that 17-18 range, and puts him comfortably in that weekly fantasy starter range just by default. And, their lack of depth at the position really kind of keeps this from being too complicated for White to break out, as long as he can stay atop the depth chart there. But at the same time, he is an inexperienced NFL starter. He comes with risk if he does underwhelm in that role. Like we know Josh Jacobs had a down year in 2023 where he averaged just 3.5 yards per carry. That ranked 34th among 38 qualifying running backs. And still the Raiders stuck with him for a significant workload every single week. But Jacobs at the same time comes with more pedigree and NFL success than somebody like a Zamir White. So maybe the leash isn't as long there for Zamir White if he does deliver similar inefficiency. But, I thought White looked decent in his limited starts in 2023. He averaged 4.7 yards per carry across those 4 games at the end of the season. That was tied for 15th, 73.9 rushing grade, tied for 18th. And he was the overall PPR RB9 over those final 4 games as well, without posting that league leading efficiency or anything like that. It was just purely based on his volume. So, nothing exceptional as an NFL running back that we've seen so far. He wasn't an exceptional prospect coming out of college either, but you consider the potential workload. It doesn't need to be exceptional to find fantasy success. So obviously every little bit matters if he can be better than what he's shown so far, but just maintaining that spot on the top of the depth chart and the workload that comes along with it, I think puts him well within breakout consideration for 2024 here.
Yeah, like you said, he played well in his 4 games. He was RB9 over those 4 weeks. The one thing that I kind of got excited about with him was the Raiders' offensive line as well. They kind of drafted a couple guys, one each year, the past couple of years, and have stuck with them, and they've slowly but surely improved. So the line's looking fairly good as a run blocking unit. They added Jackson Powers Johnson. That I knew it was 3 names. I was trying to remember how the 3 names go together. But they added him to the offensive line. He was one of the most exciting run blockers of this draft class. So I think the offensive line should be a big help for White this season. There has been a lot of hype for Dylan Labe this offseason and training camp. But like you said, I think he's going to be that third down back. I think he's going to be an exciting kick returner if he gets that role, and teams are kicking to him. So I think that's going to be part of the hype for him as well. But I think with Luke Getsy as offensive coordinator, with Getsy, that's probably the biggest concern I have with White is throughout Getsy's career back with Chicago, they had a 2 or 3 man committee last year. With Green Bay, it's always been 2 guys. It was either Aaron Jones with Jamal Williams earlier on, and then A.J. Dillon more recently. So it seems pretty clear that they're going to have 2 guys. I'm guessing it's going to be White and Labe as the 2 guys. So that's going to limit his touches a bit more than what we saw last year when he was averaging those 21 carries per game. So I think that'll go down a bit. The big thing for me, or I guess 2 big things for me, is one, we have not really seen him as a receiver to this point because he's only played those 4 games. The Raiders were generally doing well in those games, so they just ran the ball a ton with White. So I'll be curious what his target share will end up being this year. I think the one thing that would really help elevate him from that like RB20 range to potential top 10 running back is if he starts to see more targets and can do well with them. But we just haven't seen him in a big enough sample in a situation where he could be getting targets. So with the hype for Labe, it might be a case where he's not seeing a ton of targets if Labe is taking the third downs, and especially like the 2nd down and 10, 2nd and 11, those kind of situations. That's where some teams really differ in when they're using their early down back versus their late down back. And you can kind of get a sense of how much they trust their late down back if they're starting to put them in those situations. So I'll be curious what they do on those kind of plays. And then it's just a simple, how good are the Raiders doing in general? They have a decent team that could end up doing well and have a playoff push. They could end up being the worst team in the division. There's a wide range of possibilities that happen with the Raiders. And when you have an early down back that does not have a history as a pass catcher, then you really need to be in a situation where you're winning a lot. So you're racking up those rushing attempts to get the volume you need for fantasy versus if they are losing a lot, then we might see more Labe on the field than White. And then White probably won't be a fantasy start in that situation. So I think those will be the 2 keys for him. But his ADP is right now RB21, and I think that's the kind of risk that you need to be taking when you're there, because you're either going for one of those 2 down backs that's either really safe that you know won't be a top 10 or top 15 running back, or you're getting someone with risk, or you're getting someone that's in even more of a less clear committee than what the Raiders have, because the Raiders, at least right now, it seems pretty straightforward that it'll be White and Labe as the 2.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it definitely feels that way. And like you said, the part of the risk with him, there's just so much unknown. Like we don't even know who the starting quarterback is going to be for the Raiders yet. So there's definitely like a lot of projection that goes into it and trying to figure out how these players are going to fit into these roles. And yeah, it does seem like White's a safe bet to get some playing time. But like you said, with Luke Getsy at offensive coordinator, how much of that playing time is going to be shared with his teammates, like a Dylan Labe, for example. So it's going to be another one that we'll have to sort out here. But yeah, the bar probably low for a breakout season just based on him not having done anything really in the past. But I think there's a decent chance here that he can kind of have his best season yet, and hopefully outperform his ADP while he's at it. So let's go on to one more name here. And I'll be honest, I'm starting to get a lot more nervous about this one after almost all the hype being around his teammate, Chase Brown. But I'll kind of go over what I like, at least, about Zach Moss of the Cincinnati Bengals here, because there's definitely some similarities with our breakout running backs. Obviously, opportunity being a major necessity. And Moss, much like the previously mentioned Zamir White, is expected to replace another workhorse running back for his new team, Joe Mixon off to Houston. So Mixon as Cincinnati's lead back with a heavy workload has led to no worse than a PPR RB13 finish in 5 of his last 6 seasons. Moss, also like Zamir White, doesn't really come with the NFL pedigree as his predecessor, but the concept is fairly similar. His team might not have much more of a choice but to rely on him in a similar manner, which ultimately correlates to startable fantasy production, right? So we've seen stints with Moss as a starter in 2023 where he was able to provide encouraging fantasy production. He started, I think, 6 games with the Colts last year, averaged 23.7 opportunities per game, 16.8 PPR fantasy points per game over those starts, which included 2 top 5 weekly finishes at his position. So I don't think we should be expecting him to carry that same workload in 2024 with a new team, because even Joe Mixon averaged just 18.9 opportunities per game last season for the Bengals. So I'm really looking at him like 15 to 16 opportunities per game for Zach Moss. I think should be enough to help him outperform his current ADP, which is RB28 on Underdog right now, and hopefully break out here in 2024. Now, I don't want to do, like, again, the one-to-one comparison between Moss and Mixon, because Mixon, he's just been one of the most solid and reliable fantasy assets for the running back position these past several seasons, and is, again, almost always finished as a PPR RB1 by season's end. But I don't think anybody's really expecting Moss to necessarily finish as a top 12 fantasy running back, especially considering his ADP. But I think by making kind of the most of his opportunities with the Bengals, leading that backfield in carries, maybe get some targets in there, he'll have a shot to get there on any given week, right? And we've seen him flash potential throughout his career. He's earned a solid 83.3 career rushing grade that ranks 25th among 46 qualifying running backs over the past 4 years, not too far off from Mixon's 86.0, which is 20th. But Mixon obviously accomplished this on like double the workload. But Moss has at least shown like an ability to be effective with his touches. 0.2 missed tackles forced per attempt, that's 12th. 23.3% first down touchdown rate is 20th over that same span among qualifying running backs. And I think, what kind of helps his case too this year is being on one of the better offenses in the league with Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, all expected to kind of lead the way this season. That touchdown potential in this offense, I think, is going to be above average for players like a Zach Moss, who is projected as the team's lead running back and favorite for short yardage situations. And that hasn't really seemed to change all that much with the Chase Brown hype, because Brian Callahan has said that Moss is likely to get that short yardage work, which would be huge, right? Like last season, Mixon led all running backs in goal-to-go carries with 31. He converted 8 of those opportunities into touchdowns. That ranked 20th in terms of first down touchdown rate. But yeah, the conversion rate bar isn't set that high for Moss, but leading the league in those opportunities is probably going to be the more difficult feat to kind of replicate there. But he should at least get those opportunities in that offense. And that's what I kind of like about him. We saw him on goal-to-go carries last year. I think he had 16 of them, converted 3. So hopefully he could be a little bit more efficient than that, especially, if they're on a better offense. But yeah, like I know the Chase Brown stuff is probably going to be the most concerning, but how are you feeling about Zach Moss / Chase Brown here heading into 2024? Do you have a favorite, or are you leaning any sort of way here?
Right now, I'm leaning Moss. I know there's been a lot of reports about Chase Brown and getting more of the first team reps, and I'm not reading too much into that so far. We've seen plenty of situations, more so with like rookies and then incumbent quarterbacks, where it's a person who's been there longer gets the reps with the starters earlier on in the season, and then the person who is newer has to earn those reps to be the starter. So that happens a lot with free agents too, where it's not these top tier free agents, which Zach Moss was not a top tier free agent. So since it's pretty clear that these two are in competition, it makes sense to me that Brown's the one getting the more of the first team reps to start with, because he's been with the team longer. And plenty of teams have that kind of philosophy. So if we're seeing Brown see all of the first team reps, like in the preseason games, especially further on into the preseason, then definitely we'll start leaning more towards Brown over Moss. But this early, when we haven't even had any preseason games yet, not too concerned about who's getting snaps with the starters at that point when it's the incumbent person. So there's that. Like you were saying with Mixon, a lot of this is the Bengals team and that opportunity there with him consistently finishing as a top 12, top 13 running back. It's how good the Bengals offense is when Joe Burrow's healthy, when Jamar Chase is healthy, when T. Higgins is healthy. We haven't seen all three of them healthy together in a little while. A lot of them have dealt with one thing or another these past 2 seasons. The last time we really saw all three of them healthy, Mixon was RB4 that season, and that was 3 years ago at this point. So a lot of this has to do with the Bengals situation. You look at Moss's numbers, you laid some of them out, and none of them stand out too much among running backs, but that's also true if you looked at Mixon's numbers. He just had those touchdowns and had those opportunities that the Bengals gave him. So I think either one of these backs, if they're able to get the same role that Joe Mixon had, would exceed ADP by a significant margin, which is why you want to draft either one of them based on where they are at their ADP. The probably biggest concern is, like we were talking about the Raiders running backs, and we could talk about how White and Labe could coexist, with White being the early down back, Labe being the passing down back. And that's not going to be the case with Moss and Brown. Both of them have played predominantly on early downs throughout their career. We could very well see someone else, Travion Williams, for example, being the third down back. So one of these two running backs, it's either going to be they're splitting carries, in which it's going to be a headache for fantasy managers throughout the season, or one of them takes the lead, in which case you can start them and you're not starting the other one. So there's a lot to be played out between the two and how these snaps will be distributed. But if one of them can become the clear starter like Joe Mixon was, then they are going to be a clear fantasy starter throughout the season.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, hopefully we get some more information in the preseason as to how they're going to kind of utilize these backs. It'll be tricky. We'll see what the preseason shows us, but like just getting that sense of who's going to be the lead back there. Again, like you said, it's the situation more than anything else, more than the actual running back themselves. So if it's Chase Brown, it's Chase Brown that could have the breakout season. If it's Zach Moss, then, you know, we laid out all the reasons that we like whoever this RB1 is for Cincinnati, but very much hoping that it's not like a split in what it was compared to previous years where Joe Mixon just handled the large majority of the touches. So we'll see. Hopefully, again, the preseason gives us some more answers to that. But as of right now, I'm with you. I'm kind of leaning Zach Moss for still, even with the Chase Brown hype. So that's kind of our list of running backs that we like as breakout candidates. We did have a few others who we considered, but just didn't really fit the criteria that we were looking for. Thinking about someone like a Devin Achane, who was being drafted as a top 10 back right now, and he averaged 18 PPR points per game across 10 games last season. Like he already broke out. He shouldn't be on any breakout lists anymore. But a few of the other names, Nate, Kenneth Walker, Brian Robinson, Javonte Williams, Gus Edwards, Jerome Ford, a few of the names that were kind of on the fringe of potential breakout for us. But anyone that you want to touch on briefly here specifically?
I think Walker's an interesting one with Seattle. They have the completely new coaching staff. They drafted Zach Charbonnet in the second round last year, and he became the passing down back. But it could very well be this new coaching staff views how to distribute these snaps differently than what we've seen in the past with Seattle. For years, it's been, here's the clear early down back, here's the clear third down back. It's been pretty black and white how those situations have been, and then it's been different running backs in those roles over various years, but that's how the snaps have been distributed. And that just might not be the case in Seattle this year. We don't know how the snaps will be distributed. What we do know is the coaching staff, offensive coordinator coming from Washington, where they ran a lot of passing plays. If they're going to be pretty pass heavy, they might want the running back with more pass game experience on the field a little bit more often. So that could lead to more from Charbonnet and less from Walker this year. So that's probably my biggest concern there. A lot of Walker's stats, they're pretty good for a running back, but not so good that it's not out of the question that you could have him off the field more often than what we've seen the past couple of years. So that's probably my biggest concern there, even though he fits the criteria of someone who hasn't finished as a top 15 running back, but could see a step forward this year if the offense is playing really well, and that leads to a lot of touchdowns from him, for example.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. That's kind of exactly where I was at with Kenneth Walker. Like I thought, 16.7 opportunities per game last year, finishes the PPR RB20, didn't really have a big role in the passing game. And like you said, Ryan Grubb coming over from Washington, we figure that they're still going to be pass heavy like they were last season. So like, I think it's definitely possible that Kenneth Walker could have like a better fantasy year than he's had, but like not so much better, I guess, that it would qualify as like a breakout or something like that. As far as like kind of how I was looking at it, he definitely could, like, with touchdowns and things like that, and some variance. And if he does get that passing down role on top of his early down work, like obviously there's all those things, but I just don't think it's as likely for Kenneth Walker and in Seattle this year.
Well, also just the offensive line's always been a concern for Seattle.
Yeah.
They lost some of their better run blockers. Jason Peters didn't re-sign. It's a bit of a mess on the offensive line perspective as well. So that's something that, especially for guys that are specifically 2-down backs and aren't going to get much work in the passing game, I look a lot at the offensive line for those kind of players. And Seattle's offensive line, if anything, expect them to be taking a step back this year rather than forward.
Yeah. How about Brian Robinson in Washington? Because he looked good last year. Like I think similar to Walker, I thought he played really well. I think he's probably better than Austin Eckler at this point, but it doesn't necessarily mean that Eckler won't have a role into eating into Robinson's opportunities, whether it's passing down or whatever. But he's another one, like he finished as a PPR RB21 last year. I don't know that I'm expecting him to finish that much higher than that. Are you on the same page here about Robinson being on the fringe?
Oh, yeah. To me, this looks like a pretty clear two-back committee where Eckler is probably going to be the third down back and take significant work on early downs as well. So I think because it's going to be split like that, like Eckler wanted to find a place where he could play, where he could be in a two-man committee. If you look at their grades over the past couple of years, they've been relatively similar. Eckler's been the one to grade a little bit better as a rusher, Robinson a little bit better as a receiver, but both of those have been on the much smaller sample sizes. So Eckler, like, he started his career as a third down back. More recently was everything but third down, but now he's back with his old coach who used him as a third down back before. So I just see this as a pretty clear, they're going to split snaps, they're going to split opportunities, and especially when you have Jaden Daniels at quarterback and the potential for Daniels to take some of those rushing touchdowns away. And like Eckler has a reputation on the goal line as being well in those situations too. So compared to some of these other backfields where, like we were talking about White, where we know White's going to be the early down and Lave the third down, I'm concerned more about Robinson as an early down back because he might not be getting those touchdowns either due to Daniels or due to Eckler.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. Any of these other three guys that you want to look at? Javonte Williams, Gus Edwards, Jerome Ford, anybody that you were kind of starting to feel like a potential breakout, but then, talked yourself out of, I guess, at the last minute?
Oh, yeah. Like Edwards and Ford, you start getting to the point where their ADP is so late. They're more so in sleeper range than anything. Like Jerome Ford, a lot just has to do with Nick Chubb's health. The Chubb isn't healthy anytime soon. And the longer it takes for us to get any positive news on Chubb, the higher I expect Ford's ADP to go. But Ford was like generally a fantasy starter last year, despite splitting time with Kareem Hunt. So I could see the same thing this year where, yeah, there's going to be some weeks where he really doesn't do all that much, but he's probably more often than not going to be a fantasy starter until Nick Chubb's back. And even when Chubb's back, then it'll probably be Chubb and Ford splitting snaps. So it would really take Nick Chubb to be back in a lead role for Ford not to work out at his ADP. So he seems like a steal at this point, at least.
Yeah, for sure. Like it definitely feels like some of these guys probably more value than Breakout, just based on where they're drafted. We'll see what happens with Javonte Williams. Like, rumors of him being like a cut candidate as well. Like, we know Jaleel McLaughlin looked good last year when he played, and Audric Estime, maybe a rookie sleeper as well. We'll see what happens with him. But yeah, Javonte Williams, I mean, he had a good year as a rookie. I don't know what's going to happen with this Denver backfield this year. Like, it could very well be a committee. We could see Williams still, earn a big role. We could see him get cut. We could see him maybe go to the Dallas Cowboys, for example, which would be very exciting. But there's just a lot of question marks, I think, with guys like Javonte Williams and maybe even Gus Edwards as well. J.K. Dobbins is supposedly healthy and going to have a big year, but again, that's a huge question mark. So, someone like Gus Edwards was RB22 last year. He accomplished that on 13 rushing touchdowns, which was tied for the second most at the position. So how much better he's going to be than that if he doesn't, hit 13 rushing touchdowns again is a question. But yeah, I think it's just for these guys, we could like them as values more than potential breakouts, I guess.
Yeah, the Broncos, it feels like we've been hearing hype for all of the running backs recently, which isn't great to try figuring out how things will be distributed. And you always hear like people getting hyped up as well when they might get traded. So that's always a situation with Williams. Like, I was reading other people's tweets of like Jordan Mason starting to get more of the backup work in San Francisco, for example, and like, would you rather have Mason or Elijah Mitchell? And I'm like, well, Elijah Mitchell is probably more likely to get traded and therefore more likely to get playing time. So I might actually want Mitchell out of those two running backs, because if he goes to somewhere like the Cowboys, then you get more playing time. So like with the Broncos, it's always been, well, they have Sean Payton, and Sean Payton has a long history of great running backs, but this could be a 4-man committee in Denver. So I don't know.
Yeah, it's that's the way I'm kind of thinking it's going to end up happening. It's just going to be kind of messy there for the season. They got some capable bodies that could all play a significant role. So we'll see how it plays out. Obviously, for fantasy, we're hoping for one name to emerge, but I just don't know how likely that's going to be this year. But that's going to be a wrap for us today. So thank you all very much for tuning in. If you're on the YouTube, feel free to like and subscribe. We'd greatly appreciate that. And while you're there, drop who your favorite breakout running backs are in the comments as well. I'd love to hear them. Nate, thank you to you as well, as always, for dropping knowledge, but we want more. So what else do you have going on this week at pff.com for the good people?
Well, we are at the end of July, and I just crossed the 100 article threshold for the month. So I have over 60 player profiles up on the website. I've been going through league winners at each of the positions recently, as well as perfect draft strategy. Have them for 12-team leagues, 10-team leagues right now. So that's been a lot of the content, and we'll continue. We'll be writing about some of these breakout running backs in the next week or so, as well as breakouts at other positions. Draft strategy by position will be coming these next few weeks, as well as we get the preseason starting tomorrow. So the first preseason recap of the year will be up tomorrow, regardless of how many or few starters are playing in the Hall of Fame game. I'll at least find something to talk about.
Love it. Yeah. Looking forward to that for sure. As for me, I've written up my dark horse candidates to finish as the overall QB1, RB1, wide receiver 1, and tight end 1 this season. Some are on the site now. Others will be dropping the rest of the week. Then I'll actually be recording a short YouTube video going over the dark horse QB1 candidates probably later today to get on the channel this week. Also have an IDP episode scheduled for later this week as well with Justin Varnes of fantasypoints.com. talking sleepers and values for 2024. So be sure to check that out as well. Nate and I will be back next week, probably talking breakout wide receivers. So until then, peace out.